Hi, my name is Rachel Shapiro, and I'm sad not to be with you in person today, but I'm grateful to be able to share this work with you as I await the birth of my second child. This presentation addresses the connections and disconnections between the concepts of translingualism and transmodality. I will argue that the development of transmodality has some useful possibilities for how we understand meaning making across modes, but that there are some important material distinctions between the concepts and their histories that should keep us weary of assuming that modes and languages operate in a similar way in the world. First, for some definitions. Drawing from scholars like Suresh Kanagaraja, Bruce Horner, Minzan Liu, and Paul Matsuda, I understand translingualism as a theory and practice of language and teaching that works against monolingualist policies and views that stigmatize language varieties. Monolingualism includes a range of language prejudices, including privileging Standard English above other English varieties, both global and domestic, understanding English as the only appropriate language to be used in institutional and public spaces, presuming that most speakers have no language varieties beyond narrow versions of English, or understanding languages as stable over time and entirely discrete. Against such language biases, translingualism treats language difference as the norm and an asset in the classroom and beyond. In this understanding, languages are fluid, organic, and appropriate codes are constructed in context through negotiation among language users. Transmodality, as a budding theoretical concept, borrows from translingualism's greater discussion on the naturally fluid character of language, suggesting that modes cannot be separated from one another, that they blend and mesh and become entangled in unique and valuable ways across rhetorical situations. Most important to the conversation as it's happened thus far is the de-emphasis on the inherent superiority of print-based or alphabetic composing in the university. Rather, transmodality, it seems, would value the ways in which combining text and image accomplishes something different from what either might achieve on its own in the same context, as in the work of memes. At this point, I'd like to go a bit into the history of translingualism and transmodality to establish how they've come together before considering where I believe they should remain divergent. It should be said that the word transmodal has appeared in very little scholarship in rhetoric and composition so far. As I can tell, it was coined by Cindy Self and Bruce Horner, later with Tim Lockridge, whose voices have been central to conversations on modes and languages in scholarly and pedagogical contexts. Self and Horner explored the two terms together in a 2013 working paper in the University of Louisville's series Negotiating Differences in Language and Literacy, Translinguality/Transmodality Relations, Snapshots from a Dialogue. Much of this text from this working paper then reappears in the intermezzo web text that follows in 2015, Translingualism, Transmodality, and Difference, Exploring Dispositions, Change in Language, and Learning, which I will focus on for this analysis. It's worth noting that in none of these publications do we find a precise, explicit definition of transmodality. The term is defined rather through implication and proximity. Often, transmodality is named when it is present with translingualism, and multimodal then follows as a parenthetical or appears as a synonym for multimodality. The authors move back and forth between discussions of modality, multimodality, and transmodality, with transmodality reflecting the version of the concept that they'd like to see defined in relation to translingualism and thus a shared project against standard language or monomodal ideology. These definitions through proximity reflect Horner, Self, and Lockridge's hope that, quote, we can better understand each area of inquiry by defining it in relation to the other, and that, quote, we can redefine each in terms of the other, given what we believe are the significant overlaps and alignments in the concerns of each. However, the lack of a precise definition for transmodality means that modes and languages might get subsumed or conflated under the umbrella of a range of equally pliable meaning-making tools. In what follows, I will describe some of the promises and hesitations that arise in keeping the terms in such close company. But first, I'd like to outline what I and other scholars see as exciting about the connection between languages and modes when we think of them through the lens of translingualism. Scholars who take up transmodality and translingualism together are intrigued by the trans nature of each, the idea that when languages and modes come together, they transform and enhance each other. Translingual scholars have critiqued the term multilingual as an additive model that projects discrete modes or languages layering one upon another. The trans prefix, rather, helps us instead feature how languages and modes interact when they are brought together, what translingual and transmodal scholarship has termed synergy. Further, scholars interested in translingualism and transmodality understand that facility in a variety of languages and modes is inherently beneficial to rhetorical power in any one. We understand that additional rhetorical resources are beneficial for, rather than detrimental to, learning. And just as translingualism folks fight against monolingualism as oppressive, multimodal scholars have for years worked to push against the hegemony of print-based alphabetic text as the singular valued mode of knowledge and learning transmission in higher education. In student writing assignments, in tenure and promotion cases, in our scholarship, folks like Jim Purdy and Janice Walker have long worked to secure the digital and multimodal as valuable expressions of meaning and persuasion. In those ways and more, the political and semantic power of translingualism as it extends to conversations about multimodality can illuminate and provide new directions for scholarship and teaching in these areas. That said, I argue that in these conversations we need to be aware of compressing language difference to just another mode. As Keith Gilliard warns in The Rhetoric of Translingualism, translingual scholarship may sometimes flatten the racial, economic, and geopolitical lived realities of those who have historically been and are currently othered due to their language difference. In this way, the translanguaging subject generally comes off as a sort of linguistic every-person, which makes it hard to see the suffering and the political imperative in translingualism's most important ethical project. In fact, multimodal composition and language differences have rooted histories in power and identity that have emerged in complex and distinct trajectories. Those differences must be respected if we are to appreciate the impact of translingualism as a political project that advocates for the most vulnerable populations of students, international students, multilingual students, and students of color, while multimodality taps into a very different social and economic matrix that in some ways supports the same mechanisms that makes those populations vulnerable in the first place. While the shared historical contexts and close conceptual ties between translingualism and transmodality are generative in their discussions of synergy, of opening a full range of semiotic resources, and in pushing back against monomodal/monolingual norms, we need to keep the concepts distinct in ways that will honor their unique material consequences, composing contexts and conditions, as Tony Scott and Nancy Welch would remind us. Translingualism is a battleground with particular stakes for writers with the most to lose from monomodal, monolingual standards, given its emergence out of scholarship serving English language learners, writers of color, basic writers, and others who have been most significantly hurt by the guardrails of standard English. Non-standard English practices have historically been described as signs of lesser intelligence, culturally misguided features, and deficits to be fixed or cured. These students have been taught through our classrooms, historical and sometimes current, to internalize their natural language practices as wrong, imprecise, illogical, unworthy, and unwelcome. And, while multilingual writers' very presence in our classrooms has been treated as a problem, In the last decade, we've seen computer-based writing and digital composing shift from a side project for specialists in rhetoric and composition to a centerpiece of how we understand our role in 21st century literacy education. As an example of the divergent histories of language difference and multimodality in our disciplinary history, I'd like to consider the three versions of the WPA outcome statement for first-year composition. While the 2000 outcome statement included no reference to digital technologies, its 2008 revision added a section titled Composing in Electronic Environments, which contained specific outcomes for writing with computers. By the 2014 revision, digital writing had become so central to the work of first-year writing, so deeply ingrained in how we understand the processes of writing and research, that we see composing redefined to imply print and digital overlap. Version 3.0 explains in its introduction that, in this statement, composing refers broadly to complex writing processes that are increasingly reliant on the use of digital technologies. Writers also attend to elements of design, incorporating images and graphical elements into texts intended for screens as well as printed pages. Writers' composing activities have always been shaped by the technologies available to them, and digital technologies are changing writers' relationships to their texts and audiences in evolving ways. Meanwhile, no version of the Writing Program Administration outcome statement has addressed the growing reality of increasing linguistic diversity in our composition classrooms. As Matsuda and Skinnell reflect in 2012, the WPA outcome statement has received little attention from second language writing scholars, largely because it has paid no attention to multilingual students. They argue that the statement's neglect of language concerns may reflect the assumption that students enrolled in first-year composition courses already have a native-like proficiency in a dominant variety of English, and thus teachers can focus on higher-order concerns. But this perspective does not match the reality of our first-year writing classrooms, of course, and the WPA outcome statement may endorse our status quo response to the changing landscape of first-year writing instruction. As Matsuda and Skinnell worry, even when teachers know that linguistic diversity is increasingly the norm, they may choose not to address some of the common issues faced by second language writers because the WPA outcome statement does not include those issues. In other words, from this snapshot of disciplinary history, we can see the increasing value of digital writing in how we define ourselves as teachers and scholars, and how we understand our purpose and mission in serving students' writing development. While digital composing is gaining increasing centrality in our identity, and despite the rising commonality of multilingual students in our mainstream composition classrooms, attention to language issues has remained a peripheral concern not reflected in generalist position and outcome statements that work to unite the field. This brief analysis only goes to show how the treatment of modality and language have received uneven attention and disparate status within the bounds of rhetoric and composition, not to mention how much more deeply amplified become the social and economic value of digital savvy versus the social and economic liability of language diversity in U.S. culture, citizenship, and educational and occupational access. The disposition of translingualism and transmodality, in what I consider its best instantiation, works against historical injustices through recognition that monolingualism and monomodality are not and have never been the norm, let alone the universal means of successful communication. That said, transmodality, as it emerges out of multimodality, enjoys a different sort of cachet that is now imbued, rather than with otherness, outsiderness, and vulnerability, with a sense of economic promise, advantage, and sometimes neoliberal valuing of skills that will serve individual writers, workers, and the nation-state in the global economic market. These unique contexts associated with the histories and current realities of languages and modes should inform how we understand the concepts of translingualism and transmodality, and how we take them up in scholarship and in practice. We can at once enjoy the synergistic fruit cultivated through their proximity, Yet we can honor their individual social, political, and economic histories as we recognize how they have differently served writers as literate agents as they negotiate the ambient realities of a given social moment. Thus, we should be wary of those moves that would seem to subsume transmodality into the project and work of translingualism. Thank you. I'd be happy to respond to questions or comments at shapiror@rowan.edu. I appreciate your time and attention and hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.